In the dimly lit rooms of 16th century England, stacks of old books leaned against each other, their pages yellowed and brittle. These were not just any books. They were the remnants of a medieval world that stubbornly refused to fade away. As the Reformation swept across the land, transforming religious and cultural landscapes, these ancient texts remained on shelves, cherished by families and passed down through generations. People didn't just discard their beloved devotional works. They kept them, read them, and even shared them with their children. The older generation of Elizabethans, many of whom had grown up in a vibrant Catholic environment, still clung to the old ways, their minds and hearts shaped by centuries of tradition. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century, had revolutionized the way information was disseminated. Books, once the preserve of the wealthy and the educated, became more accessible. William Caxton, one of the first printers in England, set the stage for a cultural renaissance. He translated and printed numerous French works, including the Recueil of the Histories of Troy, which became the most popular account of the Trojan War for over 2 centuries. Caxton's translations and the works of his successors kept the medieval spirit alive, even as the world around them changed. Medieval romances, once the stuff of oral tradition, found new life in print. These tales of chivalry and adventure, often printed in multiple editions, became the pulp fiction of the Tudor and Elizabethan eras. They were not just entertainment. They were a window into a past that still felt immediate and relevant. Middle English poets like Geoffrey Chaucer, John Gower, and John Lydgate, whose works had been treasured for generations, continued to influence the literary landscape. Chaucer, in particular, was a source of inspiration for the stage, with his characters and stories finding new life in Elizabethan plays. The influence of French and Latin texts was also significant. Since the Norman conquest, French literature had been a constant presence in British culture. Even as the 16th century progressed, the exchange of ideas between England and the continent remained strong. Printers and translators played a crucial role in this cultural exchange, ensuring that medieval texts continued to shape the minds of early modern readers. These texts, filtered through the lens of medieval literature, provided a bridge to the past, allowing the Elizabethans to understand their history in a way that was both familiar and new. Shakespeare, the most famous playwright of the era, was deeply influenced by this medieval legacy. His choice of the stage as his primary medium was not just a matter of personal preference. It reflected a broader cultural value placed on the spoken word. In an age where the written word was still a relatively recent innovation, the power of speech and performance held a special place. Shakespeare's plays, with their rich language and complex characters, drew heavily from medieval traditions, from the use of personification to the incorporation of legendary histories. One of the most important medieval influences on Shakespeare was the work of Geoffrey of Monmouth, whose History of the Kings of Britain provided a rich tapestry of British history. This history, though often dubious in its historical accuracy, offered a powerful narrative of British identity, one that Shakespeare used to great effect. The legendary stories of King Arthur and the Trojan refugee Brutus were not just ancient tales. They were part of a living tradition that shaped the way people understood their nation and their place in the world. Shakespeare's plays, particularly those dealing with British history, reflect this medieval heritage. In King Lear, for example, the pagan setting and the characters' struggles with fate and morality echo the medieval worldview. The play's engagement with pre-Christian Britain, a world without the comfort of Christian salvation, highlights the tension between the old and the new. For the Jacobean audience, this tension was not just a literary device. It was a reflection of the ongoing cultural and religious changes of their time. The stage, with its ability to bring stories to life, was the perfect medium for this exploration. Shakespeare's plays were not just written to be read. They were designed to be performed, to be experienced. The actors, with their physical presence and the immediacy of their performances, brought the medieval world to life in a way that no printed page could. The medieval traditions of play and performance, with their emphasis on the live, embodied experience, found a new home in the Elizabethan theater. As the 16th century gave way to the 17th, the world continued to change. But the legacy of the medieval past remained, a powerful undercurrent in the cultural and literary landscape. Shakespeare's plays, with their rich tapestry of medieval influences, stand as a testament to this enduring connection. They are not just works of art. They are a bridge between the old and the new, between the medieval and the modern. In the world of Shakespeare, the past is never truly past. It lives on in the words, the stories, and the performances that continue to captivate audiences to this day. In Shakespeare's time, the concept of the Middle Ages, as we understand it today, did not exist. However, the physical and cultural remnants of the medieval period were still very much a part of daily life in London. For example, if Shakespeare walked from the City of London to the Globe Theatre, he would have passed through the medieval landscape. St. Saviour's Church, now known as Southwark Cathedral, stood as a midpoint on his journey, a building that had been there for over 350 years by the time he walked past it. Inside, the tomb of the medieval poet John Gower, who died in 1408, could be seen, and it might have inspired the opening of Pericles, where Gower is imagined to rise from the dead to narrate the story. The city of London itself was a living museum of the medieval past. Many of the streets and buildings Shakespeare encountered on his walks were medieval in origin. However, the way people thought about this past was different from how we do today. Words like medieval were not used. Instead, things that seemed old or out of place were called antic, a word that suggests both something ancient and something strange or whimsical. Shakespeare's plays often reflect his engagement with this medieval world, even if he and his contemporaries didn't think of it as medieval. For instance, in Pericles, the play uses medieval-style storytelling, with Gower as a narrator, and includes elements that seem outdated, like the use of Latin phrases and moral authority that harkens back to the pre-Reformation era. These features were likely seen as old-fashioned by Shakespeare's audience, but still carried meaning and resonance. The idea of the middle is a recurring theme in Shakespeare's work, both in terms of time and space. For example, in The Winter's Tale, the old shepherd talks about his wife moving from one end of the table to the middle, a movement that reflects the passage of time. In Troilus and Cressida, the prologue begins the story in the middle, suggesting a nonlinear narrative. Midnight, a time of transition and ambiguity, appears frequently in Shakespeare's plays, often marking a moment when the natural and supernatural worlds intersect. The concept of the Middle Age in Shakespeare's time was closely tied to the Church's history. The Middle Age referred to the period between the early Church and the Reformation, a time often viewed as one of decline and superstition. John Foxe, in his Actes and Monuments, described the Church of the Middle Age as increasingly corrupt and removed from its original purity. This view was part of the broader Protestant narrative that saw the Reformation as a return to a more authentic form of Christianity. Despite the lack of a clear concept of the Middle Ages as we know it, Shakespeare's plays engage deeply with medieval themes and settings. His history plays, such as those about the Wars of the Roses, are set in what we would call the medieval period, and many of his plays draw on medieval sources and tradition. By exploring these connections, we can better understand how Shakespeare's work bridges the gap between the medieval and the early modern worlds. Shakespeare's works often bring medieval settings into a modern context, making the characters and their stories feel relevant to the present day. For instance, in Henry V, when the fictional location moves from London to Southampton, the chorus reminds the audience that they are still in the playhouse, in the here of London. This technique emphasizes the immediacy of the performance and the connection between the play's events and the audience's experience. In Pericles, the character Ancient Gower also places himself firmly in the present, on the stage, bridging the gap between the medieval past and the present performance. This approach is similar to the way John Foxe, a historical figure, used teleology in his writings to connect the past with the present. Shakespeare's engagement with the philosophical ideas of his predecessors, particularly from the medieval period, is another way he connects the past with the present. For example, Sarah Beckwith's essay, Medieval Penance, Reformation Repentance, and Measure for Measure, explores how medieval concepts of penance are reflected in Shakespeare's plays. This shows how Shakespeare's works are not just stories, but also philosophical explorations that resonate with the ideas of earlier times. The transition from medieval drama to the more structured plays of Shakespeare's era is another aspect of this connection. Tom Bishop discusses how elements of medieval drama, such as direct addresses to the audience and the use of dumb shows, were incorporated into Shakespeare's plays. These elements create a sense of immediacy and involvement for the audience, making the plays feel both modern and rooted in tradition. The stages of Shakespeare's career can also be seen as a progression through different middle periods. Edward Dowden, a 19th century critic, suggested that Shakespeare's middle plays, written in the world and out of the depths, are his most masterful works. These include plays like Hamlet, Othello, and King Lear, which are often considered the peak of his artistic achievement. Hamlet, in particular, is often seen as the turning point in Shakespeare's career, marking the midpoint of his creative journey. Another way to understand Shakespeare's use of time in his plays is through the concept of backstory. In Twelfth Night, for example, the narrative spans about 25 years, with the longest backstory belonging to Viola. This approach is common in Shakespeare's comedies and romances, where the story often covers a generation's worth of time. In contrast, his tragedies and history plays often deal with much larger spans of time, reflecting the weight of historical events and the burden of the past. The way audiences perceive and engage with Shakespeare's plays is also influenced by the historical context in which they were created. In the 16th century, the model of perception was very different from the rational, individualistic model that emerged in the 17th century. According to Thomas Wright and Robert Burton, perceptions were not isolated in the mind, but were part of a whole-body experience. Impressions from the senses were fused in the brain, then transformed into emotional and physical responses. This holistic model of perception is reflected in the rich, sensory environments of Elizabethan theaters, where the stage and the audience were part of a shared, immersive experience. For example, the tomb of John Gower, a medieval poet, illustrates this holistic model. The tomb is divided into 3 parts. The lower part shows Gower in prayer, the middle part features allegorical figures, and the upper part suggests the divine. This structure invites the viewer to engage with the tomb on multiple levels, not just intellectually, but also emotionally and physically. The rich colors, gold, and intricate designs create a sensory experience that is as much a part of the message as the inscribed words. In the theater, this holistic model meant that the stage was not a rationalized, empty space, but a rich sensory environment. The Globe and Blackfriars theaters were filled with visual and oral elements that engaged the audience's senses. Actors, props, and stage settings were part of a complex, dynamic visual field, creating a shared experience that was both immediate and immersive. This approach to perception and performance is very different from the rational, individualistic model that became dominant in later centuries. By understanding the historical context of Shakespeare's plays, we can better appreciate the richness and depth of his work and the ways in which he connected the past with the present. In the world of Shakespeare's theater, the traditional unities of time, place, and person, which were so important to some playwrights like Ben Jonson, were often ignored. Shakespeare's plays, for instance, frequently play with time, compressing years into hours or exploring multiple time periods simultaneously. In Henry IV, historical events spanning decades are condensed. In Othello, there's a complex double time scheme, and in Cymbeline, the story spans 3 distinct historical epochs. This fluidity of time was natural to Shakespeare and his audience. Beyond the manipulation of time, Shakespeare's plays also had a deep, almost magical, connection between the actors and the audience. According to Joseph Roach, the actor's performance was not just a representation, but a kind of sacramental presence, similar to the way the Catholic Mass is believed to bring the presence of Christ. The sound of the actors' voices and the intensity of their gazes were thought to have a physical impact on the audience, evoking real emotions and even altering their physical state. This idea of the real presence of the characters was a powerful element of the theatrical experience. This approach to perception, which emphasizes sensory experience over rational judgment, connects Shakespeare to the medieval world. In medieval thought, the senses were not just means to gather information, but were deeply intertwined with emotional and spiritual experiences. This is evident in plays like Twelfth Night, where the opening line, "If music be the food of love, play on," sets the tone for a play where music and sensory experiences are as important as the words spoken. The play's setting, Illyria, is more a sensory and emotional space than a geographical location. In Hamlet, this sensory and emotional connection is particularly striking. After encountering his father's ghost, Hamlet decides to adopt an antique or antic disposition, a term that had a dual meaning in Shakespeare's time. Antique referred to the old and the past, while antic suggested the grotesque and the fantastical. Hamlet's decision to retreat into this antic state can be seen as a way of connecting with a medieval world of ghosts, purgatory, and magical transformations. The play itself is filled with elements that blur the lines between the real and the imaginary, the past and the present. For example, The Mousetrap, the play within Hamlet, is a performance that is both ancient and medieval in style. It uses a dumb show, a silent performance followed by a spoken drama, a technique common in earlier plays. Hamlet's commentary on the play, much like the role of Gower in Pericles, guides the audience through the experience. The goal is not a verbal confession from Claudius, but a display of genuine emotion, which Claudius provides when he calls for lights and leaves the scene. This approach to theater, where sensory and emotional experiences are as important as the words spoken, is a hallmark of Shakespeare's work. It reflects a medieval view of perception, where the senses and emotions are deeply intertwined with the rational mind. This is why, even today, Shakespeare's plays continue to resonate with audiences, inviting them to experience the world in a way that is both immediate and profound. The essay explores how Shakespeare's late plays, particularly Pericles, reflect a fascination with the medieval era, a time period that was becoming a distinct cultural category in the early 17th century. Helen Cooper has highlighted Shakespeare's deep engagement with medieval romance traditions, which are evident in his plays from The Two Gentlemen of Verona onward. Shakespeare's works often blend these medieval elements with other genres, creating a unique fusion. However, in his later plays, often referred to as romances, these medieval elements become more prominent and less blended, suggesting a deliberate focus on the medieval. In Pericles, this focus is particularly clear in the scenes that take place in Pentapolis, where the play introduces a tournament and heraldic displays that are distinctly medieval in feel. These elements are not present in the play's sources, such as John Gower's Confessio Amantes or Lawrence Twine's The Pattern of Painful Adventures. Twine's version, for example, features a tennis match instead of a tournament, reflecting a more contemporary setting. Gower's Confessio Amantes depicts a more classical context, with athletic games that were alien to medieval readers. Shakespeare and his co-author, George Wilkins, chose to deviate from these sources, adding medieval elements that are more in line with a romantic and chivalric tradition. The use of John Gower as the play's narrator further emphasizes this medieval aesthetic. Gower's style, with its rough, old-fashioned tetrameters and archaic language, creates a distinct sense of a bygone era. This aligns with the play's broader themes of fortune, providence, and the cyclical nature of life, which are more characteristic of medieval thought than of the Renaissance. The decision to introduce these medieval elements in Pericles suggests that Shakespeare and his contemporaries were beginning to view the medieval era as a distinct and valuable cultural tradition. This is significant because it reflects a growing interest in the past, and a recognition of the Middle Ages as a separate and rich period in history. The play, therefore, not only entertains but also engages with the evolving cultural identity of the time, suggesting that the concept of the Middle Ages was becoming more defined and appreciated in the early 17th century.